God morgon, hyvää huomenta, good morning. Hanatinget 2023 står i beråda.
The Hanating 2023 is ready to start with the heading of how should we deal with the Russian threat. Ladies, gentlemen, ministers of defense. 16 years ago, the then Minister of Defense, Jyri Häkämies, said, quoting, "The three worst threats in Finland are Russia, Russia, and Russia." And that was very polemic at that time. Now we are a lot wiser, and we are ready to call spade a spade. So a threat is a threat. And that's why we had this heading for today. On the 24th of February 2022, we saw that the Russian imperialism will stop at nothing. One of the threats became real. The non-aligned countries, Finland and Sweden, took their conclusions only 83 days after the Russian attack to Ukraine. Both had applied for NATO membership. And judging by everything, Finland will be soon accompanied by Sweden in NATO. And to quote our president, then the Finnish membership in NATO will be complete. In the east, there is an expansive dictatorship which is testing us, trying to create confusion and insecurity, or just protesting against us. On the eastern border, there is an action initiated by the Russian authorities, influx of migrants, the same as in 2015 and 16, but more blatant today. An example of hybrid activity. We are not quite sure about the whole picture now, who has an interest in cutting gas and power pipelines in the Baltic. But we know what it entailed. A year ago, we met here under the title Finnish-Swedish Defence Cooperation in the New Era. This cooperation is still a very current issue. We are NATO countries. We have DCA agreements with the USA, but we need to continue our bilateral cooperation in defence that we could do in the framework of NORDEFCO. How should we deal with all these levels? As you notice, we have lots to cover today, and so fasten your seatbelts and we'll kick off. I will be moderating today. My name is Stefan Wallin. I was previously Defense Minister and also Minister for Nordic Cooperation. And as usual, we have very high-level guests here today, politicians, researchers, and civil servants who will share their views. The Finnish and Swedish Parliament's defense committees have had bilateral meetings this morning already, talking about the situation in the eastern border. Now, some logistics. We are a three-language event. You can use Swedish, Finnish, and English. There is a simultaneous interpretation. Choose your channel if you don't have your headphones yet, so put up your hand and you will be handed one. And those who do talk, close to the microphone, please, so that the interpreters can hear you. This seminar will be streamed in YouTube. It is also possible to follow these at a distance, comment, ask questions in Twitter. You can see the Twitter wall hashtag, originally Hanating. At 11:30 there will be lunch, light lunch, some pie, fruit, something sweet. It will be very quick because we will convene again at 11:55 and continue at 12 sharp. So now I have the pleasure to give the floor to the director of Hanasaari, Gunvor Kruunman. The floor is yours, please.
Excellenza.
Your Excellencies, distinguished Ministers of Defense and members of defense committees, distinguished speakers, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, you are most warmly welcome in Hanasaari, the Hanating conference of this year, to discuss how we are going to deal with the Russian threat in an era where the European security order that was built after the end of the Cold War has turned into an era which is full of conflict, uncertainty, and instability. Russia has destroyed the respect for sovereignty and borders and the right of states to make their own security political choices. The question that is in all our minds, what can we expect of Russia and how shall we deal with it? This is a question that our political leadership must tackle. For almost 50 years ago, Hanasaari started a series of programs around defense and security. The first conference was organized in 1975 under the heading Sweden and Finland, how the neutrality policy looks like in two countries. Security was viewed through neutrality, and today it was viewed through a NATO alliance. I can recommend some reading for you, a classical book by the legendary diplomat Christer Wahlbeck, the book Giant's Breath, or The Breath of a Giant, which has now been given out again, both in Sweden and in Finland. Our countries are closer to one another than ever since 1809. This also means that Hanasaari's task is more topical than ever during its history. We will try to live up to the expectations, and I can tell you that we need to strike while the iron is hot, and I can assure you that the forges and furnaces are hot here and the hammers are striking all the time here in Hanasaari. Knowledge and trust are key factors when we aim for a fruitful cooperation that creates added value. That's why we are also going to see a new barometer about the relationships between Sweden and Finland, and this will be interesting for everyone who is interested in this cooperation. And I can tell you that 90% of the population, both in Sweden and in Finland, thinks that security policy is an important part of our bilateral cooperation. The barometer looks like this, and it is also available online. I would like to extend my warmest thanks to our defense committees and our ministries, as well as our international guests and all the participants here in Hanasaari and online. Helsingin Sanomat and Ilta-Sanomat, the newspapers, are broadcasting live from this event. And I would like to quote the Swedish Crown Princess Victoria, who visited Hanasaari in September. She said, "We continue to face the future together. We are neighbors, we are friends, we are family." So you are most warmly welcome to Hanasaari's annual defense forum.
Tack Gunvor för det. Då går vi till vår första talare, och det är Sveriges försvarsminister Paul.
Thank you, Gunvor. And our first speaker for today, Paul Jonsson, the Defense Minister of Sweden, He is a veteran in Hanasaari. He is originally from Arvika in Sweden. He has been an MP since 2016. He is a Doctor of Philosophy in Defence Sciences from King's College, and he represents the Moderate Party. Welcome. Thank you very much for these words, Stefan. And thank you to Gunvor for all the important work that the Hanasaari Centre is doing to bring our two countries closer together, especially in security. I've been involved in this work representing the administration for quite a while, and I'm very impressed by the work that Hanasaari is doing for Sweden and Finland. It has been a year since we last met here in the Hanating conference, and it has been a year of war in Europe. This is a major change in the situation of Europe, and if we take a look in the mirror, Finland has become a full-fledged ally in NATO, and Sweden is standing on the threshold. And since last year, it has also been decided that Ukraine gets to start negotiations for both EU membership and NATO membership, and that they don't need to go through the MAP process to gain membership. Also, since last year, Sweden and Finland have been sending both armored vehicles and artillery systems and other defense material to Ukraine. The war has brought with it major changes to security and defense policy, both bilaterally and in Europe. It is our task here to discuss how to deal with the threat of Russia and the security situation in Europe. This is no easy task, and I am very humble in the face of this task. Towards the end of my presentation, I will mention some cornerstones that I think are important for the future. But to begin with, I would like to say a few words about the current security environment. And the most serious event that has taken place in Europe since the Second World War is a full-scale war in Europe. We have an aggressive Russia that is taking major steps. It is very impatient and threatening vis-à-vis Ukraine, for example. There is a very authoritarian domestic policy and extremely aggressive foreign policy by Russia, and Russia's unprovoked, unacceptable and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine is also a threat and an attack on international law. We can also see in our neighboring area that Russia is threatening both Sweden and Finland through various hybrid means. And the conflict did not start on the 24th of February 2022. It did not start on the 28th of February 2014. It is an older conflict. And for example, in Georgia, there has been an illegal invasion of Georgia in 2008. And in 2021, they wanted to create an agreement which would have prevented Sweden and Finland from becoming full NATO allies. This was put forward in the Valdai conference, but of course this was not accepted by Sweden and Finland, because this would have meant that we would have been part of Russian administration and no longer independent. Russia wants to build a Europe where the strongest rules, and it would no longer be possible for all countries to decide freely on their security political choices. We have already seen a Europe where there were different spheres of interest, and we don't want to go back to that. We need to see the development of Ukraine in a wider global context. What is happening in the European area is also happening in the Indo-Pacific area. I think the Prime Minister Kishida said it very well by saying that today's Ukraine may become East Asia tomorrow. So how strongly we support Ukraine will also play a role in the rules-based order elsewhere in the world. So the fight for the security order in Europe in the future is significant, and the greatest threat for Finland and Sweden would be if Russia would win the war in Ukraine, because that would help it drive through the ideology of the right of the strongest, both strategically and in terms of the military. And that's why we need to be prepared for a long crisis. We need to need to sustain our support for Ukraine. It is also important that Ukraine, which belongs to the Euro-Atlantic family, also becomes a member of the EU and NATO as soon as possible. And in the Vilnius summit, there were some long-term security measures related to Ukraine that were presented, and that Sweden has also committed itself to. Sweden has also provided major financial support, economic support, educational support, and defense support. And we need to develop this support in accordance with the needs of Ukraine. And we must also be able to increase our defense industrial capability. So what do we need to do to secure the European security order? First of all, we need to continue supporting Ukraine. We need to invest in our own and national defense capability. We need to do what NATO has proposed in terms of deterrence and defense. We also need to deepen our cooperation between EU and NATO, and we need to put in practice the strategic compass. We have decided to use 3% of our GDP to defense expenditure. This is absolutely necessary, but it's not enough. There are ideologies or there are lessons that we need to learn from the war of Ukraine. War is a cruel thing, but it's also something that can teach us a lot. We need to have a strong defense. We're talking about both quantity and quality, and it is important to learn from what Ukraine is doing. And we also need to invest in our own national defense together with other NATO allies. And the new regional defense plans must receive sufficient resources. And we need to cooperate. So the regional plans are going to be extremely important in the future of NATO. And thirdly, we need to further deepen the Nordic cooperation in defense, because in the future all of the Nordic countries will be NATO allies. We will have a meeting in Stockholm later this week to discuss this. And as Stefan said, we have new plans in relation to how we can operate in the transatlantic link. We will all belong to the new agreement, and we will all have defense cooperation agreements with the United States, which will contribute to an increase of the American influence, and that will make NATO stronger. Thank you.
Tack Paul för det. Det är bra att du tar plats i stolen för vi ska strax.
Thank you very much. Yes, it is good that you sat on that chair, because we will come back to you after the next speaker.
Ajalla olemaan muualla sattuneista syistä, mutta puolustusministerin puheen lukee meille puolustusministeriön puolustuspoliittisen osaston ylijohtaja Janne Kuusela. Janne, ole hyvä ja voit puheesi jälkeen siirtyä tähän tuoliin. Kiitos.
Tack Stefan, god morgon alla.
Thank you, Stefan, and good morning, everybody. Unfortunately, it is not the minister who is standing here today, but it is positive, though, that we have 4 previous defense ministers, so almost a full hand. So I think we will cope with all these previous ministers and a civil servant. The global security environment is undergoing a transformation which is defined by strategic competition and division into different camps. And as part of this evolution, European security is undergoing a major change. And regrettable as it may be, this is not the first time that war is raging on the European continent. NATO was founded in a then difficult global political context. And in the decades that followed, our world has faced significant military, political, and technological upheavals and changes, one of the most recent being the emergence of Russia to become an aggressive, belligerent state that we see today. But fortunately for us, unlike after the World Wars, we do not need to invent NATO now, but it is adapting to this new context. And fortunately for us, unlike then, Finland and soon Sweden are members of the alliance. The subject of the seminar, what should we do about the Russian threat? It is an integral part of the daily work in the defense ministry. This is not a new question. We have had to be prepared against the Russian threat for decades. Russia's illegal and brutal war of aggression against Ukraine dramatically changed our security environment. While Russia's shift to be a more unpredictable, more aggressive direction has been going on for long, and at least in retrospect it has been visible, it is a different matter how it has been possible to talk about that at any given time. Now we can, and now we must, have an honest discussion with our Swedish counterparts about the threats caused by Russia, discussing openly and sharing our common situational awareness. Finland's attitude towards Russia in recent history whether of us politicians or of researchers, is currently under public scrutiny and criticism as well. But this is nothing but positive. By learning from mistakes, we can avoid them in the future. But let it be said that we have done something, or many things actually, correctly. First of all, we have been determined to invest in our defense in a long term. And this is how we have shown both our partners and allies, and also to Russia, that Finland takes its national defense seriously. Secondly, we will continue to support Ukraine in its heroic defense struggle. Only last week, Finland once more decided to provide a new significant defense material package to Ukraine. We do not disclose the contents of this package to the public, but I can nevertheless assure that these materials, whose replacement value is well over 100 million euros, send another strong message that we are committed to supporting Ukraine. At the same time, we are aware that there are still open questions regarding support for Ukraine, which we must solve both at European and at transatlantic level. As part of its wider support for Ukraine, the EU set up a military assistance operation to train Ukrainian soldiers and support member states in sending armed aid to Ukraine, and Finland is also participating in these actions. The third, most recent element is Finland's contribution to NATO's common defense. NATO has defined Russia as the most important and direct security threat to the alliance. At the same time, we emphasize that NATO is not deliberately seeking a confrontation with Russia and does not threaten Russia in any way. Necessary contacts with Russia are maintained to manage risk of escalation, but the response to Russian threats and hostile actions is unified and sustainable. This is how we operate both nationally and as part of the alliance. I would also like to highlight Finnish expertise concerning Russia, for which we have traditionally been known. In order to know how to respond to the threats posed by Russia, we need to know Russia. We need to focus on improving our Russia skills, especially now when interest in, for example, Russian language studies is at a historic low. The government program underlines actions that maintain and develop our knowledge of Russia and our ability to analyze Russia's development. Critical research and special expertise should be seen as a link to security of supply and national security. Ladies and gentlemen, the tensions caused by changes and transformation has not prevented NATO from maintaining its role as the cornerstone of Euro-Atlantic security. NATO's deterrence and defense have been adapted to the requirements of the prevailing security environment, believing perhaps at times in a too good future. At the beginning of the 1910s, almost all European Union states had moved to putting an emphasis on capabilities related to crisis management. But despite all this, NATO remained strong enough and no military force has been used against any of its member countries by a third country. A turning point took place in 2014, however, and since then NATO has restored its capability to engage in conventional warfare in Europe. The 2022 Madrid summit saw the beginning of a process where NATO is undergoing the biggest modernization of its collective defense since the Cold War. It is a large undertaking, but consisting of elements that we know well in Finland to secure the operational plans required by the security environment and deploy the forces, performance capabilities, and command and management structures. And we have done all this in Finland all these years. The membership of Finland and Sweden strengthens NATO even further. With us on board, the defense of Northern Europe and the Baltic Sea, taken as a whole, can be better planned. Our countries bring a significant increase in capabilities and expertise, and a significant amount of operational depth to the collective defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, i.e. NATO's deterrence in Northern Europe will be significantly strengthened. When you combine NATO's ongoing strengthening of deterrence and defense with the added value brought by membership of Finland and Sweden, you can say that NATO has once again been able to adapt in a way that underlines its role as the most successful military alliance in history. It is also about a unique situation in world history. A common defense zone is creating from the Black Sea to the Arctic, where all stakeholders are committed to defending each other against the Russian threat. Ladies and gentlemen, the next step in NATO's development requires a completion of Sweden's membership without delay. Sweden's place is in NATO, with Finland and other allies. We have a unique relationship with Sweden. Long before the alliance was in any way a possibility, the Finnish and Swedish defense administrations began to cooperate more closely at all levels, in all branches of defense. And as this cooperation intensified, we prepared to work together even during a war. Our cooperation is seamless and it is routine, and the ability of Finland and Sweden to work together is constantly being tested in various exercises. Our bilateral cooperation will have even more opportunities as members of NATO. When all the Nordic countries are in NATO, it also makes possible to deepen the Nordic defense cooperation in order to achieve NATO objectives and strengthen security in our region, for example, by developing operational planning and military mobility. Adapting NATO to the demands of the future will require increasingly strong efforts from the European countries to improve their common defense. The production capacity of the defense industry in Europe, also in Finland, must be increased rapidly, and not only to improve security to Ukraine, but also in the whole of Europe. In addition, cooperation between EU and NATO should be strengthened with complementary and coordinated actions. The common defense of European countries will continue to underpin the vital transatlantic link in the future. In windy times, NATO must stand on both legs, on the European and on the North American leg. The United States is the most important military power, also in the Baltic Sea region. Soon, all the Nordic countries will have bilateral defense cooperation agreements with it. This is a big step in our bilateral relations, but it also adds a new dimension to the Nordic-US cooperation. NATO is the guarantor of Europe's hard security, but we are also challenged in many other areas. Finland is known for its strong overall security model, and recent problems with infrastructure and organized migration have shown that our model cannot rely on hard defense alone, but on broad interagency and international cooperation. Let me now return to the question, how should we respond to the Russian threat? We will do so by demonstrating the ability to respond and take national decisions, by strengthening the EU and NATO, by developing national preparedness and cohesion between European countries, by deepening cooperation between Europe and the United States, and by intensifying our relations with like-minded partners around the world. European history has shown that even the greatest threat can be managed, and if necessary, overcome through unity and cooperation. Regardless of global cyclical fluctuations, Our continent must always have sufficient military capacity and readiness on which to build other elements of security. Together, we will be certainly stronger, and together we will also create success in the global conditions for competition. Thank you.
Kiitoksia, Janne.
Thank you, Janne. That was very good. Good speech, and thank you for stepping in. I think we have a few minutes for discussion. The question that touches us all is what is the state of play with the Swedish NATO application? Well, of course, President Erdogan has submitted the application to the Foreign Affairs Committee a few days ago, last week, and their meeting has been adjourned and discussions will continue this week. And we want to become a NATO ally as soon as possible, of course, especially considering what is happening in NATO with the regional defense plans now, and as the resources are being enhanced. This is very important so that we can mobilize all the resources that we have. I've been a member of parliament, and I don't like someone else to tell a parliament what to do, but now it is being discussed in the Turkish parliament, and there has been a lot of support for the Swedish membership. Well, we certainly hope that it will take place as soon as possible. One question to both of you. We're talking about the European, Nordic, and Swedish and Finnish defense materials capability. Are we able to produce these materials quickly enough? Because the need for them is endless. Do you have any good advice? Well, a lot of things are happening in the Nordic countries. We are cooperating in producing defense materials. Since 2019, we have an agreement that will an agreement for preparedness that will certainly be continued and joined by others. We also have or are making different agreements as regards the acquisition of defense materials. We also need to increase domestic production to enhance our domestic defense. And fundamentally, this is a matter of importance for our national defense, but also NATO's defense. We need to have a dialogue. We need to establish new models of agreements that were not necessary before. But the war in Ukraine has taught us that we need to have things in store. This was so well put that I don't know if I can say very much, but very briefly, the only way to go forward is to make investments in the long term, and we must coordinate our efforts. We need cooperation between EU and the NATO, and also Nordefco that will meet in Stockholm later this week, chaired by Minister Jonsson here, and this matter will be discussed there as well. So we have a lot to do in this respect. It's going to be very interesting to see what Nordefco's role can be in this process. Perhaps there will be a Nordic committee in NATO. We have very little time, but I will give one question to the audience. Reine Nyberg. Thank you. I have a proposal to Minister of Defense, Mr. Jonsson. how the cooperation between Sweden and Finland could be increased. Perhaps you should inform your Finnish colleague about interpreter education, which is something that we don't have at the moment. It is something that is behind, it's a secret that's behind the fact that in Sweden there are people who speak Russian. And I must tell you that we are following your example. Thank you for this comment. Our entire foreign policy administration, there are a large number of diplomats who have taken this interpreter education, and speaking about the cooperation between Finland and Sweden, which I didn't touch upon so much in my presentation, but in the future you will continue to be our closest friends. And of course, the exchange of information that we have had is very useful also for this cooperation between Sweden and Finland, considering, for example, the situation when NATO is expanding its regional defense plans and strengthening them. It is extremely important for the defense of both countries to know each other already before you need each other's help. And we have a very good cooperation in this respect, and we will certainly continue this cooperation, and it will be beneficial for the entire NATO. Thank you, Paul. This is something that we should or could be talking about for a long time. So this time, unfortunately, we will have to stop our discussion with you now because of we need to take into consideration your timetables, but I would like to thank both of you very much.
All right, and our keynote speaker is, she comes from the United Kingdom / Stockholm. She's the UK ambassador to Sweden, former UK ambassador to Georgia, 2013-15, and to the Ukraine, 2015-19, and since 2019 she's been Swedish UK ambassador to Sweden. Judith Gough will speak under the headline Stronger Together, where the UK is leaning into Nordic-Baltic security. Och om någon märkte här tidigare så använde Judith inte hörlurar när det talades svenska. Det beror på det att hon har lärt sig svenska under sin tid i Stockholm. Varsågod.
Excellenser, bästa ministrar, ledamöter, tack för det, Staffan. Det är en stor ära som...
Thank you, Stefan. As a Brit, it is my great pleasure to thank you and participate in this forum. I thank you very much for the invitation. It is an honor and a pleasure to be standing in front of so many friends, and that we have a common theme that is important for us. It is friendship. Am I right? Friendship is very important because alliances and friendships make us stronger together. I will be speaking in English in my proper speech. So I'll switch languages now.
On the 24th of February 2022 was really one of the most shocking and pivotal moments that I can remember, and it has turned European security on its head. Putin's act of aggression has precipitated the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. It has brought large-scale, high-intensity land warfare back to our continent, with implications for all of us. And in the UK's integrated review, our big strategic vision for the future in 2021, we, before the invasion, identified Russia as the most acute threat to our security. It's also the most acute threat to Nordic-Baltic security. Unfortunately, many of us old Russia hands, and I know there are some in the room as well, we saw it coming. It wasn't a surprise. Quite a few did not see it coming. I think wanting to believe that Russia would not take such a brazen step and invade a neighbouring sovereign country. Many judge rightly that this would not be in Russia's strategic interests, and so that is being proven. Nonetheless, UK and US intelligence pointed accurately to Russia's military build-up on Ukraine's border and a clear signal of intent. In fact, you didn't really need intelligence reports to identify and understand what was coming, to understand that Putin had not given up his objective to subjugate Ukraine, that he had not surrendered his view that Ukraine is not a sovereign country and does not have a right to choose its own democratic Euro-Atlantic future. Unfortunately, Russia is not the only problem that faces us. There is a growing prospect that the international security environment will further deteriorate in the coming years, with state threats increasing and diversifying in Europe and beyond. And what we see in Israel and Gaza highlights this only too well. The risk of escalation is greater than at any time in decades, and the strategic stability mechanisms that helped in the 21st century to mitigate the risks of understanding, miscalculation, and unintended escalation have either stagnated or failed to keep pace with developments. Systemic competition has intensified, and authoritarian states are challenging the basic conditions for an open, stable, peaceful, and prosperous international order, often working together to undermine the rules-based international system or reshape it to suit their own objectives. Now, if you Google me, and I don't recommend you do this in the Russian language, you will find out one of the very few accurate things is that I'm 51 years old. That's probably the only accurate thing that you'll find about me on Wikipedia. And in my lifetime, I never thought that we would see a return to full-scale war in Europe. I never thought that my 9-year-old son, who went to school in Ukraine whilst I was ambassador there, would ever ask me, "Mummy, which of my friends are alive and which of my friends are dead?" and that I wouldn't actually know the answer. But I tell that because that's the reality that we now live in, and that is the reality that we have to respond to with determination and resolve. One of the positive consequences of the invasion of Ukraine, and we have to look to the positives, we have to hang on to those positives, is the renewed purpose and cooperation that we see amongst Western allies and partners. And we are indeed stronger together. Putin has relationships of coercion and transaction. Our security and prosperity is firmly grounded in alliances, partnerships, and friendships. And some of the UK's strongest partners and friends are to be found in this region, not least Finland and Sweden. And it goes without saying, as you have heard from the defence ministers, that Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine has had a profound effect on both countries. Both Sweden and Finland awoke that morning with a clear understanding that they had very similar protection against Russia as Ukraine did, i.e. not much. Article 42.7 of the Treaty of the European Union offered some reassurance, but it's nothing like the guarantee of NATO's Article 5. And NATO is the foundation of collective security in the Euro-Atlantic, and our collective commitment to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is our most powerful deterrent and protection. So a proposition which was previously unthinkable, and certainly if anybody had told me at the beginning of my posting in Stockholm that I would be looking at Sweden and Finland joining NATO, I would have been slightly surprised, is now a reality. Finland is now happily a member of the alliance, and we are delighted by that fact. And it is a top foreign policy priority for the United Kingdom to see Sweden in NATO as soon as possible. Both countries join as highly capable, interoperable allies and net contributors to European security. The UK quickly recognised that the period between Finland and Sweden announcing their intention to join NATO and their actual accession was potentially one of vulnerability. This and the fact that the UK was no longer covered by Article 42.7 as we had left the European Union gave us the impetus to offer Sweden and Finland written security assurances. So in May last year, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and we've had a few Prime Ministers, I grant you, over recent years, but the agreements are still extant. We still stand by them. Let me be very, very clear. Travelled to Harpsund in Sweden to sign bilateral mutual security assurances with Sweden, and then on to Helsinki to sign a similar agreement with Finland. And these assurances, as I've said, are politically binding, and we continue to stand by them, regardless of NATO membership or regardless of the situation. And in these declarations, we confirmed our shared desire for closer, stronger defence and security cooperation, recognising that we share the same security environment in Europe and that we face common challenges. We agreed that we would assist each other, including militarily, upon request, should one of our countries suffer disaster or attack. And you may have noticed that the UK has stepped up its exercising and engaging bilaterally with Finland, Sweden, Norway, and the Baltic states. And we play a leading role within NATO as Europe's largest contributor. The UK is proud to lead NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence mission in Estonia. We've got nearly 1,000 troops deployed in Estonia and a further 139 troops in Poland, all at high readiness. We've deployed the Stormer high-velocity missile and the multiple launch rocket system to Estonia and sent 3 Chinook helicopters plus 120 support staff to Tapa last year. I'm going to turn to the JEF, which I think is one of our favourite subjects in Sweden. And for those of you who don't know JEF, it's not a middle-aged man from Middle England. It sounds like it. But it's the UK-led joint expeditionary force comprising the UK, Nordic and Baltic countries, and the Netherlands. And it's a key contribution to European security, which the UK is proud to lead. Launched in 2014, it is 10 nations working together, delivering forces at high readiness across a range of roles, increasing capacity and complementing NATO, not competing with NATO, but complementing NATO and other European and global security arrangements. Its focus is the High North, the North Atlantic, and the Baltic region. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the JEF has increased its activity across maritime, land, and air domains, providing additional levels of security across our region. In the past 12 months alone, the JEF has carried out 88 activities. Exercise JEF Warrior took place in and around Norway in March and tested the interoperability of the JEF nations' armed forces in a challenging and realistic setting. The UK's Standing Joint Force Headquarters has deployed to Sweden, and it deployed to Iceland in June. And the UK's Carrier Strike Group deployed to the Norwegian and North Seas this autumn, and I'm really pleased to see so many people from the Defence Committee of Sweden here who I last saw on board HMS Queen Elizabeth a couple of weeks ago in Gothenburg as a genuine sign of our commitment to Sweden and to regional security. Russia's aggression has given the JEF added impetus and value and a much more high-profile political dimension. The first JEF Leaders Summit was hosted in London just over a month after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The third JEF Leaders Summit was hosted just over a month ago on the strategically important island of Gotland. And during this summit, leaders announced a new 10-year vision for the JEF and committed to further work on the protection of critical national infrastructure and, importantly, as referred to by both defence ministers just now, defence industry cooperation, which we are going to have to take a much more integrated and long-term perspective on. Some have questioned the future of the JEF now that both Sweden and Finland are joining NATO. But the fact is that the JEF's agility and regional focus, as well as the like-mindedness of its members, means that the JEF continues to provide vital security and reassurance and is an important complement to NATO. And the UK will continue to lean into the JEF with partners. And the JEF also has a role to play in supporting Ukraine, as well as deterring Russia. And it's no coincidence that President Zelensky has addressed all 3 JEF Leaders Summits. Jeff nations, including Finland and Sweden, have been at the vanguard of providing vital military assistance and political and financial support to Ukraine. On Gotland, Jeff leaders vowed that the Jeff would remain resolute in its support for Ukraine in this conflict and beyond. And so far, the UK, with partners, has provided over 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers with training. This is the largest military training programme of its kind on British soil since the Second World War. We are the second largest donor of military assistance to Ukraine, committing £4.6 billion to the country so far, and most recently announcing a £100 million package that will assist Ukraine's armed forces to clear minefields, maintain its vehicles, and shore up defensive fortifications to protect critical national infrastructure, something that will be vital this winter as we expect Russia once again to start targeting that infrastructure. We need to ensure that Russia cannot prevail, and we should take heart from the bravery and the resolve of Ukrainians as they fight for their sovereignty and freedom. Ukraine has pushed back the Black Sea Fleet and made Crimea a vulnerability for Putin rather than a strength. Since their invasion, Russia has suffered over 250,000 casualties. Half of the territory they have seized has been taken back, and Putin has faced a more united response than he can have imagined. He has ensured defence spending is rising across Europe. He has fast-tracked Finland into NATO with Sweden close behind. And he's also seen an armed rebellion advancing on Moscow. His hope is that we lose patience or divert our attention elsewhere, and we have to show that we won't. That's why the UK is leaning into the Nordic-Baltic security. That is why we need to show strategic patience. And this is particularly true in the Arctic or High North. The UK is not an Arctic state, but we like to think of ourselves as the region's nearest neighbour. Just about a tip of Scotland is almost there, if you look closely at the map. So our security relies on maintaining the High North as an area of high cooperation and low tension. But the receding ice, Russian aggression, and Russian-Chinese cooperation challenge this equilibrium. The Arctic is one of the most rapidly changing regions in the world. That is why we continue to exercise with partners in the North, and why early this year we published our new Arctic policy framework, which I recommend to you. And we will work with our Arctic partners and allies to contest malign and destabilising behaviours and activity in the region, and we will support efforts to reduce strategic dependence on Russia. I think there's always an expectation when a British ambassador gives a speech that there's got to be a quote by Churchill in there somewhere. And I'm not going to disappoint you. I did consider Mannerheim because he has some fantastic quotes, but I felt on safer ground with Churchill, so do forgive me. Churchill said that to build may be a slow and laborious task of years. To destroy can be the thoughtless act of a single day. With our partners, we are building. We are building a peaceful, stable, prosperous future based on democratic principles and values, where countries can choose their own destiny, free from malign influence and coercion. We are building. This is a long-term strategic endeavour which Putin seeks to destroy. We cannot and must not let him. He thought he would take Ukraine in 3 days. He was wrong. The Ukrainians have valiantly proved him wrong, and we must continue to show him that he is wrong. Our strength is in our unity of purpose, our interoperability, and a willingness to defend our way of life. This is why the UK is delighted that Finland and Sweden are becoming closer allies, and why the UK will continue to lean into the Nordic-Baltic region and support our allies and friends. Tack så mycket. Kiitos.
Tack så mycket. Thank you very much, Ambassador Judith Guff. We really feel that the Nordic countries and Finland and Sweden and the UK, we are playing in the same Premier League of mindsets, to put it that way. Tack så mycket. Nu ska vi kalla upp två, eller egentligen en och en halv ska vi säga.
We will now have two more participants in the debate. Teija Tiilikainen, first of all, will speak about how cunning is Russia? And this matter is more topical than ever. Teija Tiilikainen is the director for the Hybrid Center on Excellence in Helsinki. She has been the director of the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, and she has also been active in the network of European studies at the University of Helsinki, and she is also a doctor of political science from Åbo Academy in Finland. And our other panelist is not Martin Krag, who was unfortunately taken ill, but we have Malcolm Dixelius remotely. He is a journalist and writer, and we can see him here. Welcome, Malcolm. Great that you could step in. He is a journalist and author who is well versed in what's happening in Russia, and he has been the correspondent of the Swedish radio in Moscow, for example, during the 1990s, in early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And he has also published recently a self-biography, an autobiography, under the heading of Confessions by a Russianized Swede. When I heard Paul Jonsson's reply to this question, I thought that it would not be difficult to also recruit Finnish officers and other military personnel into the Swedish military interpreter education. So let's establish a framework for this discussion. Just a couple of points. In 2022, President Zelensky spoke remotely to the Finnish parliament, and at the very moment when he opened his mouth, the websites of the Finnish ministries for foreign affairs and defense were collapsed. And even though there were a couple of firewalls, a week and a half ago, paperless refugees started arriving on bike from Russia. It seems that the Russian authorities are sending them our way, and they are testing our reactions and using real people as their tool. We know that the NATO membership applications of Sweden and Finland did not cause any major disturbance from a Russian side. It may be that they had already discounted us as NATO allies earlier. And of course, they had their hands full in their genocide in Ukraine. How cunning is Russia actually? And to quote today's headlines, what can we expect from Russia? And what are the spontaneous thoughts that come to your minds by the current situation at the border and considering the hybrid activities? So perhaps Teija Tiilikainen will start. Well, this must be seen as a part of the major conflict that is useful for the Russian leadership and its imperialist and nationalist project. They need this to strengthen and facilitate the support of the Russian people. They need this conflict to show that the West is weak and that the collective West, as Putin says, is continuously prepared to compromise on its own values. And this is the light in which all of these operations are presented in Russia, including the confrontation with Finland. So Russia is searching for our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities that they can attack, that are key values that they can attack. So the question of how cunning is Russia, I think this is a tactic that they are using. It's a conscious strategy that they're using. One day it is the Finnish border, another day it will be our digital systems, critical infrastructure somewhere in Europe. So it's nothing we can predict or interpret. So that's part of their strategy. They strike where and when we least expect it. So I think their cunning operations are one part of the hybrid attacks. They want to show or demonstrate their power, their strengths, and their nationalist project. They want to create the impression that others are even weaker. I remember in 2013 when I was acting as a rector in London, and we discussed with our colleagues in Poland and Lithuania. They already knew what to expect, but I believe that in many countries, for example in 2022, there were a number of countries that did not want to accept the fact that Russia is what it is. I started studying Russian in the 1990s. I believe we all were hoping that Russia would turn into a democracy, that it would develop into a country with which we could cooperate, because there is a great potential. But the biggest sign of the reality was shown in 2008 when Russia attacked Georgia. This is something that we were not able to ignore. Unfortunately, you can will something, that's what we say, but with Russia, it's not necessarily true. We have a leader like Putin. It's not possible. Putin shows us what he wants. 8 months ago, he wrote a letter. It was quite clear what he wanted to do with Ukraine. When I was the ambassador to Ukraine from 2015 to 2019, I was always prepared for the scenario that Russia would attack Ukraine, but it didn't happen under my time in Ukraine. But I believe that now Putin has showed his cards. No one can deny this. This cannot be denied. Unfortunately, Russia is a threat that we need to learn to deal with now and in the future. Thank you. Malcolm, the same question to you. You have been living in Russia for years during the old regime. You have been monitoring what's happening in Russia. Is it the case that the Russian narrative and their boldness surprises us time and again? Have we been too naive here in the Nordic countries? Well, I've been wondering time and again how naive I have been. Russia is a nice place to live. Russians are nice people, and in what's happening in the leadership of the country may surprise you. A good friend of mine said to me, a friend of mine from the Finnish Defense University, they have a saying that you should never underestimate the Russian bear, but you should not overestimate the Russian bear either. So you need to see what happens. And of course, it is the case that the Russian aggression in Ukraine will be resolved in the war zone in Ukraine. But at the same time, through the hybrid operations, Russia has shown its weakness. And it is interesting to see how primitive and proactive they are in their operations. So every time there has been a hybrid operation, it was predictable. It's been a long time since Russia invented anything new. Sending refugees to the border has happened not only in 2015, but also in 1992. They did the same thing when they wanted to get rid of undesirable citizens in their country. They sent them to Finland. So there is a systemic weakness in Russia. They have invented very little new things, very few new things. And at the same time that I was writing my book about my experiences, I've had to do with Russians for more than 50 years. And during this time, Russia has not invented anything significant, with the exception of Kalashnikov, for example. That was invented in the late 1940s. So everything keeps repeating itself, including their way of thinking. And I do believe that we can tackle this. But before we close the discussion, I would like to raise our gazes to the helicopter level. How long-term, what is the long-term perspective that we will have regarding Russia? Because it's not going anywhere. It's going to be our neighbor in the future as well. And I think this is not discussed enough. Thank you. In Finland, Teija, you were interviewed by a TV channel, MTV3, last weekend about what kind of hybrid campaigns Russia might have during our presidential election campaign. Well, we have the habit of thinking that as we have a very clear consensus, a very strong consensus in Finland, and this is a very strong consensus among the presidential candidates as well, Russia has nothing to win in trying to influence the election campaign. So, because all presidential candidates are very much in agreement about Russia's policy. But it's not only the election result that Russia has been trying to impact in earlier elections. It's also the ideals of democracy, the values, the belief of people in the political system, in the political leadership, in the democratic system as a whole. So I think this is a risk that we need to take into consideration as well. So an open society is something that is maybe threatened here. We have seen it before. It has taken different forms in earlier situations, Russia's efforts to exert influence on the election results, for example, and also in the debate before the election and during the election campaign. And in social media, it is very easy to steer discussion as well. There has been something that is a so-called discipline called criminology among those who are well-versed in what's happening in Russia. It's very popular to try to interpret and analyze the power structures around Putin. Perhaps Malcolm and Judith, how do you see the power structures around President Putin? Are there any power structures at all? Well, this is a billion-dollar question that's very difficult to answer, but I don't think that Putin's decision to invade Russia was very popular in the Russian sphere of power. It looked like it was a big strategic mistake. The sanctions, the freezing of assets, etc. And they are a very much isolated region now, and it's very difficult to become aware or to know what is happening within Kremlin. But it looks like Putin as a leader is isolated, but he still holds the power. What will come after him, it's not easy to predict. And nevertheless, we need to be prepared for Russia being a threat and an enemy. It was said earlier that we need to cooperate in order to be able to counter the Russian threat. What does Malcolm Dixelius say? Well, I would like to identify with the discussion by Russians in exile. And there are three different scenarios as to what can happen. It is very likely that Vladimir Putin will be re-elected next year, but it is not so likely that he would be in power or remain in power for 6 years because his health is not so strong. And the war in Ukraine will also undermine his people's trust in him. And he has been making a balancing act in the different centers of power. He is not the same kind of dictator in all spheres of power. His loyal supporters may represent some 15 to 20%. And opinion polls that say that people are for the war, nevertheless, 80% of the people don't want to lose the war and be humiliated. What will happen later? It is likely that we will have Putin #2, a new leader that comes from this very same small circle that will inherit Putin's position as this represents distributing of awards within a very small circle. But if there is if we try to see further and find a prime minister that would be more willing to negotiate and perhaps find a way out of the war. And it is interesting to see who would be most popular among the people. It would be the Prime Minister Mishustin that we don't know very much about. He has not distanced himself from the war, but he's very particular with not mentioning the war at all. He has the aura of cautiousness that perhaps would fit in well with international negotiations. What would or who would be Putin number two? That's difficult to say. There is Nikolai Khrushchev, who takes decisions when Putin is unable to do so, but he is the same age as Putin. So he is not a figure of the future, but his son, Dmitry Patrushev, who is the Minister of Agriculture, he would probably be a good candidate for the nearest circle if they needed to change Putin to someone else. I have not been to Russia after the pandemic, but I do have some sources. Well, it's interesting that often the competencies of dictatorship reside in the same family. Now it is time for the audience to ask questions. The floor is yours.
Ställa antingen till Malcolm på distans eller till de två närvarande.
Either to Malcolm, who is remote, or to our panelists in the room. If there are no questions in the audience, I see one hand.
Elisabeth Rehn.
Minister Elisabeth Rehn.
Det har pratats mycket om att vi behöver.
Yes, we've talked a lot about unity and being together. The Nordic countries and Europe in particular need to act in concert, both in NATO and in the EU, so that we can cope with helping Ukraine and fight Russia, if I can say so. But are we so unified? Are we in agreement? There will be elections in several countries, new leaders stepping in. Can we cope with this situation?
Något svar?
Ja, Malcolm börjar.
Alltså,
Malcolm will reply. Yes, I keep wondering myself. We do need a helicopter perspective, which is not sufficient, though. We are surprisingly unified. The Ursula von der Leyen and Jens Stoltenberg, who are now the most important politicians in Europe. These leaders that European peoples look up to in order to cope with the crisis or manage the crisis. Of course, being in agreement and concert is important, but this helicopter perspective means that we can't come out of this crisis with the present resources in Europe or with the present resources in Europe and the US, because for the first time ever, we need to be aware that there are many countries in the world that Europe needs to tackle the war. Countries in Asia and in Africa feel so that way. We need to help Ukraine to have a diplomatic solution in order to progress to peace negotiations. They don't only need to win the war on the battlefields, but when Ukraine are invited Saudi Arabia to the peace negotiations, that was really of concern to it. But countries who are outside the Security Council and who want more influence in the world. Maybe they can't offer the path to peace, but they want to stand along with Ukraine, and this we cannot underestimate. Thank you. If this is a reply enough, then we can take another question.
En Putin förväntade, eller många har förväntat.
Well, I do agree that we are more united in Europe and in NATO than what Putin expected. And I include also Japan and other democracies here. But we need to expand our diplomacy to other countries, to include other countries, India, China, and I'm referring to the United Nations too. We are too focused on those who agree with us. Now we need to go and talk with those who don't fully agree with us, Russia being a threat, and thinking why should they care about war raging in Europe, because we've had wars around us for a longer time. So that's why we need to now think more globally. What is our diplomacy? And this is what we are now starting to do in the UK, so that we all need to defend this world order. If we do not achieve that, there is the risk that it turns out poorly. Elizabeth Wren's question was very relevant if we think about the continuation of this conflict, a long-term conflict. How long will we think in concert and be in agreement? And of course, that also has to do with finding a correct balance between our democratic world order. How much can we direct or steer the people how they should think about Russia? So the balance needs to be there. But at any rate, what we need to agree on in the longer term is that international rules should be respected, and the key questions around war and peace and military action. So that is something that the united partners need to focus on, independently of what democracy leads us to.
Riksdagsledamot Hanna Gunnarsson, varsågod.
Then a very targeted short question, please.
Försvarsutskottet i Sverige.
Hanna Gunnarsson from the Defense Committee from the Swedish Parliament. Malcolm, you said that Russia could have a more pragmatic prime minister. Does Russia want to have better relations with the rest of the world? And would the world like to have more pragmatic relations with Russia?
Vi måste vara realistiska.
Definitely, I think so. We need to stay realistic in this, of course. Where is Russia standing now? The people are more dependent on China, and that is embarrassing to Russia. Putin, who claims and boasts being a historian, wants to take Russia to a state where it was before the Middle Ages, when Russia was dependent on a greater Asiatic power, and he wants to wants to be closer to Turkey, for example, in that part of his country. But the people of Russia will not accept those plans. Most of those 100 million people who live close to the Russian western border feel Western. They do not understand why that is not acceptable, and it is an obstacle for Russia to make that part of the people understand that they want to be part of Europe and or the Western world, and they need to therefore respect the Western rules. That is the weakness and the cunningness of Russia. They want to disperse NATO. So it is a sign of weakness that Russia cannot understand that these international organizations already exist, and they are now present in democratic countries. But the majority of the people in Russia feel more European than Asian.
Måste man spela med europeiska spelregler.
If you want to play the game in the European way, then you need to accept their rules. And if you live by a river, you need to learn to swim with the crocodiles. It is 11:30. I would like to thank all the panelists, and thank you also to Malcolm, who joined us at short notice. Thank you, Teija Tiilikainen and Judith Goff.
Och nu har vi halvtid hemmalagelle.
So we will now have a very short break. The home team is leading 1-0. It is a short lunch, and at 12 sharp we will continue with the second part of this forum.
Okej. Klockan är...
All right, we are approaching 12 o'clock. In fact, it is 12 o'clock, so it's time to continue. I hope you enjoyed your light lunch. And we are going to continue with scholars, a scholarly dialogue under the heading, What will the new European Security Order look like? We have Director Jakob Hallgren from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, Deputy Research Director Eva Hagström Frisell from the Swedish Defence Research Agency, Deputy Director Kristi Raik from the International Centre for Defence and Security in Estonia, and Research Fellow Jyrki Lavikainen from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Welcome, everyone. And I will also sit down here. So we have agreed that we have as we have a rather extensive topic, I will give each scholar 5 minutes to speak about the topic and reply questions from the audience. So perhaps we will give the floor to Jakob first. Thank you, Stefan, for the opportunity to be speaking in Hanasaari for the first time. A lot has been said already. Very good ideas that we've heard during the morning. So I will elaborate on those and take up some new perspectives. If we talk about the future of the European Security Order, perhaps it's a good idea to look into the past as well, because nothing happens in a historical vacuum. The historical developments are influencing Russian thinking, at least. There have been many efforts to establish a security political order in Europe. Not all of these efforts have been as sympathetic as others, and there have been backlashes as well. Thinking about the Peace of Westphalia in 1658, and the Congress of Vienna with the balance of power, Wilson's 14 points, and the League of Nations 1919-1920, when the all nations' right to self-determination was codified, the UN Charter after the Second World War, and the European idea of never again. The European security order after the Second World War was relatively chaotic, and of course it took place in the shadow of the power struggle between the United States and Soviet Union. But the main components of the European security order are well familiar to us. The first and most fundamental, of course, was the final act of Helsinki in 1975, and a number of other agreements, other documents, also a number of documents that took place after the Cold War, the Paris Peace Agreements, Istanbul Summit Declaration, and Astana Declaration. And of course, the EU project is also built upon the idea of never again, as well as NATO. And speaking about the new security order in Europe, we have to say that, as people have said here, we are looking at a very difficult new chapter, and a dangerous new chapter in European history. There are other very serious crises apart from the war in Ukraine, including those in the Middle East, but the Russian crisis is an existential crisis. Russia has violated basically all of these agreements that were striving for peace, stability, arms control, transparency, democracy, etc., etc. But we can also say that most European states are still adhering to the European security architecture and are prepared to defend it. And in the new system, no country wants to end up in a buffer zone. Russia is being supported by China. And another problem in the whole is that Putin's war has turned into a Russian war. And a third problem is that Russia seems to completely ignore its well-being and welfare in the long term. And we can draw some conclusions. In earlier European history, the security order was being challenged by Russia, which is no longer able to accept the status quo. And for example, during the war in Crimea, this was evident, and this Russia is prepared to pay a high price to get what it wants. For small nations, for small countries, it is extremely important to secure the principles that we are defending and also secure the necessary resources for doing that. And as after the Second World War, we must make sure that Russia is involved in the same development. This means that we need to stop European expansionism that we are witnessing in Ukraine. If Russia wins the war in Ukraine, the European security order will be shattered to pieces. We need to make sure that we can secure the European security order and make sure that those who want to join NATO can do so. And we need to make sure that there are enough resources, including industrial resources, military support for Ukraine, etc., etc. Russia is trying to win time, and I hope that the United States continues to support Ukraine, and I hope that Russia will soon grow tired. And of course, we need to continue dialogue with them and with all others. If we lose this fight, it may be that we need to go back to raw principles, as was the case in the Peace of Westphalia. And the way we deal with the Russian crisis at the moment will be decisive in terms of how the European security order will develop in the future. So this is not a new system, it's about defending the existing system. Thank you.
Mikrofonen vandrar vidare till Eva.
Thank you. I will now give the microphone to Eva, please. Thank you. It is very challenging to come up with anything new, but I would like to take up 4 points that affect the European security order. First of all, the Russian full-fledged invasion to Ukraine. It is a turning point in European history, and it makes an end to the international order that we are used to. And this security policy change or transformation that we are now faced with in Europe requires of European states a different way of foresight. We need to combine our values and our geopolitical interests. And if we start with the Russian invasion, it is an ending point to our common norms and principles on the cooperation-based European security order. And the way Russia has been acting since 2008, aims at building a new security order where the right of the strongest prevails. But this also is against the UN basic rules and charters. China is involved too. They try to adapt their environment in accordance with their own interests. And for example, what is happening in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, and so on, also contribute to more threat. Then Russia and China that are major threats to the rules-based world order that traditionally the Western democracies, USA and Europe, and other democratic countries in other parts of the world have maintained. And this going back from a democracy and what it means for the future is seen in many countries wanting to balance between the major powers in order to avoid conflict. Many countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia strive for an order where their interests are taken into account. We do not know what the future world order looks like. We need to influence so that it is developed in the way that we see fit. But we don't know. NATO and EU are now strengthening European defense, supporting Ukraine very strongly, creating security against Russia. There's a new way of building frontiers to Russia. But we also need to support other vulnerable countries in the West Balkans, in Eastern Europe. And while the US is looking at China and the Indo-Pacific partnerships, we need to take that into account, but we cannot focus only on security in Europe. But we also need to look at the stability in the Indo-Pacific region and also what happens in Middle East. All the scarce resources that we have also have an impact on how we prioritize. And to finish with, now that world is in a transition, we need to look at our own values. What do we want the world to look like? But we shall also face the challenges and decide how can we combine our values with the geopolitical interests in the future. That is for me. Thank you. Kristi then.
Tack så mycket. Kiitos, että saan olla mukana tässä keskustelussa.
Thank you for involving me in this discussion. This is an ambitious discussion. There are lots of answers that we have already heard. I would like to say what is the continuity in this whole situation. Of course, we'll talk about European security order, which is undergoing a transformation. Russia is exercising military power against a neighboring country, trying to change borders between countries, and this is a turning point, an important one. But where I do see continuity is how Russia sees the European security order. It is actually very much rooted in the imperialistic history of Russia. We already heard references to earlier historical agreements and treaties. The Russian leadership during the Ukrainian war since 2014 referred to the Vienna Congress, made reference to the Yalta Agreement after the Second World War, which actually leads us to think that once again Russia wants to become a party in an agreement between the great powers, where the spheres of influence are for these great powers, and Russia is now ready to use major military force to improve its own situation in this situation that could be then the solution. Of course, the Western countries, the European countries, we cannot accept that approach. We take the principles seriously, which are in the UN Charter, in the OSCE agreements, where Russia is actually a party. But you need to remember that, in fact, to what extent Russia has respected these principles has been very selective. The UN order was created in the aftermath of the Second World War, where Russia was occupying a major part of the European continent. And back then, there were central security policy norms and principles that were set up. And during the Cold War, Russia did stick to those rules, although it was still occupying a major part of the European continent. And the principles in the UN Charter, although they are really good, did not apply or were not applied in the countries where Russia was in control. Then after the Cold War, the situation looked very much different, and maybe finally the sovereignty of countries and the right to choose a democratic order, the right to choose their own security policy approach would become true for all European countries. And we also wanted to believe that Russia was committed to this situation. But in the 1990s, there were many signs that Russia never felt really at home in the post-Cold War order. It didn't withdraw its troops from the Baltic countries only in 1994, after a lot of pressure from the Western countries. Did it withdraw its troops? Lots of conflicts were created in the earlier Soviet countries, also in the Transnistria and parts of Estonia were having conflict. So Russia wanted to keep its sphere's influence. And when Putin was elected in 2000, it systematically wanted to restore the imperial Russia and also get Western acceptance to its own sphere of influence. And this was in the December 2021 documents that were mentioned earlier, that Russia presented the US and NATO. So the reason why I wanted to take this approach in the discussion is that it is important to see what is the historic continuity that led to this fully fledged warfare raging in Europe today. From the perspective of Russia, it wants to change the European security order in a way that would mean a return to history, what we have seen earlier in European history and what we thought in the West was now past history, but the Russians see this, or Russia sees this differently. And it is a big question now whether Russia at some point in time could change its own imperialistic approach towards its neighboring countries. There are many former imperialistic countries in Europe where they saw that it is no longer possible to keep up that imperialistic situation. And it is also to be wished that Russia comes to that same conclusion. Maybe if they lost clearly in Ukraine, it could create discussion and debate in Russia whether keeping up the imperialistic vision is realistic in today's world. But as neighbors of Russia, we cannot take that as a starting point, but we need to understand that Russia is not going to change. There are no signs of Russia giving up its objectives in Ukraine, and it's not giving up its larger objectives from December 2021. It is trying to maximize its possibility to expand. And in order for this situation to be stabilized at some point of time, hopefully, when war ends in Ukraine, maybe the war freezes and there is no clear solution, but in order to find stability, then in the Euro-Atlantic security structures, we need to be prepared to defend. EU and NATO are the cornerstones on which our security is based and which need to be strengthened. So we need to have a strong ability to defend and also create deterrence so that war is not expanding to a war between NATO and Russia. And this is what Russia is aiming at. They are using non-military means to achieve their own objectives. There are new crises, hybrid influencing. We need to be prepared against those too and need to think that in the long term, the relations to Russia will remain difficult for as long as Russia doesn't leave its imperialistic aspirations aside. So this is what I wanted to say for the time. Thank you.
Joo, kiitos ja pyrin pitämään huomioni lyhyenä, koska tähän
That's Yuri. It is difficult to add anything after Christy, actually, but in short, some conclusions. If we start by talking about the European security order and why we are sitting here today under this theme, is because there is an underlying conflict between the approach of our approach and the one of Russia. What is the mainstream idea of security in Europe? Well, in short, we have agreed jointly that each country is sovereign, each country can align or not align, if so wished, and war is not accepted as a means of foreign policy. It is also a principle of the UN. And Russia doesn't accept these principles, and as Christy said, they never did. In short, when they agreed with the Helsinki Agreement as Soviet Union, it was because Soviet Union was a status quo state which was occupying major parts of the European continent. OSCE thought that Russia wanted to make the borders official that it had conquered. But now there are no conquerors. So this is a revisionistic power who wants to receive a new sphere of influence, not to keep up the old one. So our order that we support is impossible for Russia to accept. So it's now testing it in Ukraine, whether it then can change it. It also tested it in Georgia. Medvedev said when he was president after the war that there are regions where Russia has priorities and interests which fall within the sphere of interest of Russia. So these are views that are incomparable today. Russia is imperialistic, unlike other European countries. And this is not just a complementary word that we use when we want to judge Europe, when we want to judge Russia. It is not only a Russian approach to a world with major powers have a right to their spheres of interest. But it is also a question of whether, if a country is not a major player, it is sort of a colony. This is what Putin said in the summer of 2022. And he said similar things throughout his term. So it is a long term approach by Putin. And another approach by Russia is that any means is allowed, not only war, but any other means too are accepted. And this is how Putin and Russia describes the world and describes what the US is doing. Russia sees that when it wants to achieve a sphere of influence, it can do anything. And anything is, if it cannot achieve that sphere, is if somebody goes against. So how should we then formulate the European security order? We may need to go back to the early years of the Cold War, when the European security order is set up via NATO and the EU. So we accept temporarily that the approaches cannot coincide, and we need to do something. In such a situation, an empty space is always a risk, because Russia aims to fill that empty space, not only in Ukraine, but also in Moldova and in Belarus. And we saw in Belarus, where Russia with foresight wanted to upkeep Lukashenko with fake results of the presidential elections. So a country which is non-aligned is in a risk. That's why Finland and Sweden, after the attack, made a very swift decision to join NATO. Because if we cannot deal with Russia in a way where we can agree things and principles that we agree, then we have to act ourselves. Thank you.
Olipa hyvä ensimmäinen.
Thank you, Yuri. This was a very good first round of interventions. Maybe a question to Kristi directly, because we, in the eastern border in Finland, there is a situation now. You have had similar activity in the Estonian border. What are your experiences of that?
Viroon on vastaavaa toimintaa kohdistunut.
Well, there hasn't been a similar activity against Estonia. There was a bit less than 20 people last week without travel documents that clearly Russia sent to the border. And in a situation like this, Estonia is not admitting those third country nationals across the border. So there hasn't been more pressure. But we are prepared to, and we have been helping Lithuania and Latvia also in their border regions faced with similar situations. What is, of course, unfortunate in this situation is that Russia is trying to make Finland choose between the impossible, take care of security or take care and respect the rule of law and international norms. So I don't think we have to go on that road. Russia is clearly trying to overturn the rule of law against us, is ridiculing our norms and principles. For that sort of pressure, we should not yield. And it is not possible that we can defend our values and the rule of law by giving in to hybrid attacks by Russia. The discussion is very difficult. It has been going on in Finland, and you have accepted to prioritize security. And hybrid attacks need to be fought and quickly. And in that way, you take care of your own security and your own democratic order.
Ambassadör Judith Guff sa ju i sitt...
Thank you. Ambassador Judith Guff reminded us about the mistakes Putin had made with regard to his project in Ukraine, and also the veto in NATO decision-making is making it difficult for Sweden to enter, but also the EU has some weaknesses of the same kind. In Europe, there are populist regimes that have come to power, such as that in Slovakia. Poland and Hungary are examples of these. In Poland, there might be a shift of power going on. But how do these democratic processes in the wrong direction, how are they impacting Russia's future? Are they a threat? You're quite right. We have a lot of examples from Russia. The newest problem is that on the eastern border, we have several areas where this is being accelerated and the anti-globalization movement is being accelerated. This is a huge threat. We have an authority for psychological defense that is helping us understand all the threats that are involved in this kind of activities. We have seen several examples of this. Teija was speaking about the risks and the threats to democratic norms. Our societies will remain open in the future as well, but we must not be naive. Russia is going to take advantage of it if we are. And it gets support from China, for example, and first and foremost from China. Our systems must remain open, but perhaps we should also keep ourselves better informed. Then the question about why there are people who are fact resistant, so to speak, and why they don't believe in what politicians are saying. Well, this is something that each and every democracy must tackle. We must make sure that disinformation does not spread. I believe that nationalism is always a threat to political cohesion, both in the EU and in NATO. And it is very important that we can resist the threat from Russia. At the same time, there are a number of countries which have security interests that remain even though their power regime changes. Thinking about Poland, for example, they have had the same view on the threat from Russia as many other countries do. And of course, this will impact decision-making and decision-makers. Christian Juri. Well, of course, the existence of extreme populist parties in the European countries is something that gives us concern, and we must carefully consider why this is the case. There are, of course, internal factors in each country, but there may also be external influence. And I think in this situation, as we're speaking about the ability of Europe to take care of its own security, we also need to remember that we're talking about power. And it doesn't seem to be an extremely serious threat that would make Europe stop their support to Russia. For example, in Italy, the rise of the populists did not cause any major changes in foreign policy. But the big question is what happens in the presidential elections of the United States. That's a major threat, and this election result may actually shatter Western unity and support for Ukraine. It may not happen, but we shouldn't rely too heavily on the support of the United States. It may well be that next year's election may be a turning point that will cause a collapse to the unity of the Western countries, but I would not like to be too pessimistic. It may be that whatever the election result is, the United States does not want to step out of these ranks right now. I have the unfortunate role of speaking after Christy because I agree once again with what she said, but I would like to say a few complimentary words. I see a few more nuances here because if we look at the situation in global terms in Brazilian current government, there is a lot of understanding for Russia. And of course, it is the case that looking at Europe, for example, Hungary is a case in point in terms of what happens if there's one country that imitates Russia and actually causes sabotage to Western democracies. So this kind of administration, if they start promoting the Russian cause, it's worrisome. And on the other hand, Poland has been one of the greatest supporters of Ukraine, regardless of the administration that they had previously. So it's not all that simple. And in the middle of all of this, the EU is now facing a potential new addition of new member states. There are about 10 countries standing in line at different phases of membership negotiations or accession negotiations. It's been a while since the EU accepted new members, and of course there is a will to help Eastern European countries in their democracy processes and to, in a way, evacuate them from under the Russian threat. Is it the case that the threat of Russia is the best argument, or the fear of Chinese influence? Because as Yuri said, there is a vacuum that someone might want to fill. Well, I believe, as I said earlier, that the fact that we're supporting countries that are not members of the EU or NATO, it's very important. And that's why the EU and NATO membership processes are even more important than otherwise. And we have learned that reforms must take place in these countries so that their problems are not brought into the EU or NATO after the accession of the new countries. We need reforms, we need transition periods, but there is an interest in supporting these accession projects. Do you believe in a two-tier membership so that you can access the single market, but you still need to make sure that you do your homework? Well, not necessarily. We being involved in or getting involved gradually in different forms of cooperation, that is a good thing, I think. Kristi then. Well, we are speaking about geopolitical expansion much more strongly than in the previous round of accepting new members, and it seems that the EU is taking the geopolitical arguments very seriously, and that's why support for Ukraine is considered very important, and that's why Ukraine has been given the perspective of becoming an EU member. But there is a very strong consensus that before accession is possible, Ukraine must meet all the criteria, and it is of course the aim of Ukrainians themselves. They want to be a real member that operates the same way as other EU member states. So they are not asking for any discounts. We need to see them as our ally in this process. And I would also like to emphasize that it is important that the EU and NATO proceed hand in hand so that Ukraine would genuinely have a perspective, a view of being admitted as a member. Ukraine is seeking the security guarantees that NATO alone can give. And I would say that in the end, EU membership can guarantee the development of Ukraine into a stable European country. And there's also NATO's role in guaranteeing security. So through the extension of EU and NATO, we can stabilize Eastern Europe, and that's what is our aim. I agree with what Christian Eva said, but as this question has been more or less dead for many years, it is now very clearly on the agenda, and as Kristi said, it is there for geopolitical reasons. It doesn't mean it's easy. It continues to be exactly as difficult as before, but I'm sure there is completely different level of will to look for a way forward. So we need to turn every stone in order to find a solution. This is a development that took place in Serbia, for example. It remains to be seen what the EU thinks about Georgia, even though the situation is very difficult. So there is a will to believe in European values, and this will has been demonstrated, but it doesn't mean that it's easy. There are a huge number of questions that have to do with the Constitution, for example. People almost start to look away when these things are discussed at a dinner table, but these are questions that we need to deal with. If there are any questions from the audience, you will soon have the opportunity. But one more question about the presidential election in the United States. Is it the case that the security order in Europe in the future will be dependent on who is the president of the United States? Or are we capable of making changes regardless of who is the president of the United States? Well, when we speak with Americans, they don't think that we are exaggerating this threat. Many European countries have already lifted or will soon lift their share of defense expenditure to 2%. And there are people who say that things are going to get worse. And this is, of course, very concerning. We need to convince the United States, just as we did in the 1990s, that it is in the interest of the United States to involve Europe. And of course, in the Indo-Pacific region, there's going to be a lot of challenges. There must be resources available for other directions or other regions as well. But I have to say this is a complicated matter. Eva. Well, as I said before, a second Trump period would certainly have an impact on political unity, which is very important. And what is more serious is that it would challenge NATO more than before. At the same time, the United States has a security political interest in starting to develop, and at the same time, during the Trump era, there were forces who were speaking for this. So there are more cautious voices that are making things easier. Well, perhaps I could add that when we look at the United States, regardless of the fact that the President of the United States has a lot of competences, but there are other powers as well, and in the Congress, the representatives understand the significance of Europe and cooperation with Europe very well. So it would be extremely unusual if one person would be able to destroy everything. At the same time, if we look at the Trump administration and their potential reaccession to power, what is making us think is the unpredictability of it. And I think this is something that worries us all. I would like to turn the question around related to Indo-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. Regardless of which administration has the power, they have a major interest in that region, and it started for years ago already. It's still going on during the Biden administration. And of course, from their point of view, it's quite logical if they look at who are their most important strategic competitors, looking at China's military resources, their proliferation of arms, both traditional or conventional and nuclear arms. So whatever happens, Europe will need to take a greater responsibility for its security. And no matter who has power in the United States, we need to get along with them and convince them that our views are important. I would like to add, I seem to agree fully with what Jyri said. It has been said for many years that Europe must shoulder more responsibility for its own security. This has to be true both in the EU and NATO. And in 2013, there were great decisions taken by the EU to reform its defense structures, and the aim was for the European Union member states to increase their defense spending. But in February 2022, there was some kind of a turning point, and only after that did European Union member states really start investing in their own defense. And it seems that only as a consequence of this full-scale war was there a more extensive consensus on the fact that Russia is a long-term threat that needs to be taken seriously. also in the countries where it is not an immediate threat to their security. And if we see the possibility, maybe not very likely, but the possibility that a military attack may be targeted at NATO and that we need to prepare ourselves for that. And that's why there are the new regional defense plans in NATO. So there has been a major turnaround in European countries, also in the sense that we are now investing in the collective defense of European countries and their allies, whereas in earlier times the focus was on managing crisis. And of course we need to ask ourselves why the progress has been so slow, how we now are trying to make the defense industry to operate more efficiently. And of course, the change is very difficult politically. Thank you. We now have a few questions from the audience. We will start with Yrsa Grüne. Thank you. My name is Yrsa Grüne-Luoma. I'm a journalist, but also have other positions. I have a comment regarding the NATO expansion. Isn't there a risk or a danger when one country gets a special position? Russia has been referring to Kosovo as an example to their own for their own expansion efforts, just as a comment. And a second thing, freedom of expression and a free press, they are said to be the cornerstone of any such democratic procedure. Only 8 of the countries there are on the green side. So if we look at financial prerequisites, the operational possibilities of journalists, Finland holds position number 5 and Norway has been number 1 for years. How do you see the situation here? Finland is a new NATO ally and Sweden will hopefully soon follow. At the same time, there is a war, there is a conflict between Russia and NATO. As we just heard, Russia feels that they are in war with NATO. How can the free press operate in such a situation? What are the risks that there are going to be restrictions from the military or the society at large? And for the first time since 1940, journalists have been accused of leaking state secrets, and we know that certain political parties have attacked foreign correspondents and blamed them for deteriorating or undermining Finland's image in the world. Thank you. Very brief replies to this question. I don't have any good answer to give you, but I'm not familiar with this legal process, but a brief answer. Democratic principles are what we're trying to take care of, and what happens as regards different secret or confidential materials, this is of course always something that needs to be taken care of and possibly dealt with in a court of law. And the general atmosphere might lead to people not having the courage to speak. I don't recognize this in Sweden in terms of traditional media, but in social media, people's behavior is appalling. They are attacking anyone who thinks differently from them. This is my interpretation. Perhaps I could briefly comment on case Kosovo from the Russian perspective. We need to recognize that whenever Russia is using a case to justify something that they would have done anyway, and we need to distinguish this from the case itself. So Russia was doing this when they attacked Crimea in 2014, and it is absolutely certain that they would have attacked Crimea regardless of what happened in Kosovo. And if you're speaking about the case where the press had dealt with highly classified material, and it is clear that in such a situation there might be criminal consequences and penalties, especially as in this case there was no crime that had taken place. I've understood that you may not know this process very well, but in the lower court, those who were accused were found not guilty, but it will go further into higher courts. And the UN declaration from 1999 does not recognize Kosovo as an independent country instead of an autonomy within Serbia, and that's why Russia is using Kosovo.
In a morning session, we heard people saying that Putin made a huge mistake, strategic blunder because of sanctions, Western unity, all that. I just want to, caution that we haven't seen the end of it. We can also imagine scenarios where Russia will win, and if the things stay as they are, Russia has won, because they have attacked a sovereign nation in Europe, took away quite a bit of territory, and can keep it. And this will be a victory for Russia, and that will be spinned in as a victory in Russia, and their kind of imperialist mindset will only strengthen. So that leads me to a question. May I ask the panelists to imagine, depict a world where Russia has won? In terms of a West, is there a West? US standing in the world, is there going to be any? Peace in the Far East, nuclear proliferations and so forth, kind of in a broader context. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a question about the worst of dystopias, Russian victory. Vem vill börja?
Jos mä sitten
Well, perhaps I will start. Well, we shouldn't think of it as a dystopia if Russia achieves some kind of victory. They may achieve the victory that they may not achieve, the kind of victory that they originally started aiming for to control the entire Ukraine. But if they win anything as a result of this war, this aggression, they will present it as a victory to their own citizens. They will draw conclusions as to how weak the West is, not being able to support Ukraine more. So it is important to consider all of the consequences that there would be in global terms if Russia achieves at least partial victory. These will be very unpleasant consequences, such as nuclear proliferation. There will be consequences in Asia. China would draw its conclusions. It is important to have a discussion on these matters. It is a realistic possibility that there will be no clear victory or defeat for anyone for years, and that this will become a somewhat frozen conflict. One reason being that the West was not prepared or able to do sufficiently to help Ukraine win, and we nevertheless will have to live with these unpleasant consequences.
Lyhyesti lisätä tähän, että ensinnäkin tämä on hyvä.
Briefly, thank you. Question is very important. The theory about victory, on the victory of Russia, and how we feel about it. For us, it would be unreasonable to occupy small plots of land for that price. It is not reasonable. But what the present leadership of Russia thinks, human life is not important. 100,000, 1 million human lives. It is a victory if they achieve more control over Ukraine. Then sanctions are of no importance either. What is the GDP of Russia in 100 years without or with sanctions? That is what the present leadership thinks. If the borders are more extensive, then it means that they have succeeded. And the additional objective is that the Ukrainian population who stayed, their children, and their children will be brainwashed to forget about Ukraine and that they were Ukrainians. And that is then a country for Russian population. So this is a partial victory for Russia. Another point is that if Russia achieves this, it will continue having these big aspirations for Ukraine and European security order continuing to trying to control Ukraine. So this is only an encouragement for Russia. So we achieved something at least, they would say, and then putting pressure with the nuclear is one of the things that they would see as a way to success, having very serious implications on Europe and on the whole world. And it's we are a bit short of time, but maybe we could have a short reply from Sweden. Yes. The victory of Russia depends on how the situation looks like in Europe in general, if Europe is unified, or if this is a beginning to a new world order where major powers make all the decisions, and then smaller countries will be in a very difficult situation. It depends how Russia would win. And would it then spread to other countries? Very worrisome for small countries. So that was our reply from Sweden. Thank you many times over to all your insights, your what you shared, and a big hand to all the panelists.
Sådär, tack. Och nu går vi.
Thank you very much. We will continue to the last part of this seminar. We've discussed about the new European security order, and now we look at defense cooperation, how that responds to the challenges to the European security order. Now it is the time for politicians to bring their views. There are one here, Jukka Kopra, who is the chair of the Defense Committee in the Finnish Parliament, and he's from southeastern Finland, from the National Coalition Party. In the previous mandate, he was a member in the Defense Committee. Then Mikko Savola, who is the vice chair in the Defense Committee, fourth mandate from Ahtari, Centre Party. In the previous government, he was stepping in for the Minister of Defense, and now he's the vice chair in the Defense Committee. And then we have Lars Wikstedt from Sweden, sorry.
Yrkesofficer med internationella.
You have also been an officer in international tasks since 2022. You have been member in the Defense Committee.
Peter Hultqvist på plats.
And then on remote, then we have Peter Hultqvist remotely, I hope so. I was about to say, Houston, we have a problem, but he will be there in 5 minutes, I heard. So he will join us later, but we will start. The Finnish and Swedish Defense Committee members met this morning. Lots of them participating today, talking about issues at the borders, current issues. The Swedish committee wanted to have an update on the situation. They met about 6 weeks back in Stockholm. So what is the cooperation at committee level? Principal question. I will speak in Finnish. Well, we have very close contacts. After the elections, we've met several times already, and our aim is to take up contact informally and with a low threshold. And then there are regular meetings like here today, and I understood that the Swedish committee will come in February to Helsinki. So many times in the year and routinely. Mikko then.
Joo, tämä kokemus 2000...
Since 2011, I've been sitting in the Defense Committee. We have two central cooperation partners, the Estonian one and the Swedish one. These are our closest partners, neighbors, and it is important that we have discussions at Member of Parliament level. We have had intensified cooperation with Sweden. It's been very pragmatic and very good. And it's nice to know that the Swedish Parliament Committee will visit us next year. So I suppose the preparations will then start in short. I would like to underline what we heard, that we are not only thinking about coming, we will be coming and visit you, listening all your best practices. I'm fairly new in this position, but we did come here a year ago already, and we received lots of practical information that we could use. But now we need good tips on our way towards NATO and how in a short perspective we can even increase that efficiency. We have a long-standing history. You are the first ones that we ask. You're our big brothers now, and we are very thankful for all your support, especially concerning our application to NATO. Thank you. Then we have been talking about borders this morning. And now for the Finnish MPs, what is the latest update on the activities taking place in the Finnish eastern border? And how do you approach that from a political perspective? We are very much in agreement at the parliament level that we should counteract this activity. It is a part of hybrid influencing, instrumentalized migration or entry, and it is not a genuine asylum seeking, but a process that is engineered by Russia, and we should counteract that with any possible means. We've been sitting here today, so I don't have the real update for you what the parliament is deciding, but I looked at news today, lots of things happening, decisions taken, and maybe we will hear something by the end of the day if we can rely on media information. But it is clear that the government is following the situation closely and preparing decisions that should there be an escalation and things moved northwards, then measures will be taken.
Ydinkysymys on se.
Yes, the central question is what message do we want to send from Finland? Looking from the opposition, we support all the government measures. Last week there was a decision to close the southeastern border, and I hope that now that the movement has gone further up north, because this is a part of hybrid influencing and malice by the Russia and determined action by Russia, we need to do something. And the signal that we send is important, that people who think of coming to the Finnish border should not make that journey, because it is important that we act in concert. But we are very much in agreement in Finland now. Maybe nuances can be found in what is the possibility to seek for asylum, but we have looked at that from the legal point of view. For example, the Helsinki-Vantaa airport could be the place where asylum can be sought then. Thank you. So now I sat down because I saw Mr. Hultqvist arrive on screen. Remotely, I hope you can hear us from Helsinki. Nod if you can hear what we are saying. He didn't nod. He didn't wave his hand.
Hear you.
Nu hör du oss. Alldeles utmärkt. Välkommen, Peter.
So now you can hear us. Welcome, Peter, from a remote connection. You chair of the Swedish Defense Committee, fifth mandate as an MP, a Social Democrat. You've been Defense Minister for 8 years, and now you are back to chairing the Defense Committee. And your mother comes from Kuusamo. Welcome. So, Peter, a question to you. You are one of the main characters in Lauri Nurmi's book, Finland's Secret Path to NATO, where we can read that you became a fan of NATO membership on the 11th of April 2022 at 8:15 a.m. So, how does it feel now that you think back to that period of time?
It was for me, and it was for also Sweden, and for my party, it was a process to decide around NATO membership. And I make my final decision at this time, 11th of April at 8:15, in a room in the... You hear me?
Yep.
No. And so it was a process around this, and we had also a special committee that worked with it, and it was the foreign minister that were the chairman of that committee, and at the same time we had a lot of meetings in our party to prepare for this. So I cannot describe it as like something from the sky decided 8:15, 11th of April. It was the end of my personal process around this. And from my perspective, it was two reasons. One reason was that Finland has already decided. The other was that it was not possible to do proper and an effective military planning for the Nordic countries if we not join NATO. It should not be effective for Sweden, and it should not be effective for the other countries in Scandinavia. So that was the reason. So for me, it was mainly military operative perspective on it. I really analyzed this for myself, and we also tested alternatives, but this was the best solution in the end of it. And this was also something that was a conclusion of the Russian war in Ukraine. Because before the war, the strategy, what I understood and what I was involved in, both from Finland and Swedish side, was that we should deepen in the cooperation with other countries in Western Europe and in NATO, and we should also invest in our own military capability, but not do this in a way that can make arguments for Russia to do things at the Finnish border or in the Finnish Bay or in the Baltic Sea. We will not give them that argument, but when they decided to attack Ukraine, it was another situation.
Tack för det. Det är många frågor man kunde försöka diskutera på politisk nivå också när det gäller.
Thank you for that explanation. Yes, at political level, it is possible in many ways to approach this question in Finland and Sweden. And the question concerning defense material in Sweden and Finland was addressed between defense ministers. But it is problematic to increase production, although demand is high, and not only by Ukraine, but also we also have demand in Finland. What can we do at political level so that the production could be increased? Is there any political influence, or is it just market-based? Well, the problem being that storages in the Western countries have been very small because we didn't anticipate a long-term war, and we have sent a lot of support to aid to Ukraine. So the capacity of European defense industry is not sufficient to meet the needs in Ukraine, let alone in order to meet the needs in the other European countries. So we need to take decisions in order to deal with this. So more storage and meeting Ukraine's need. Sorry for a long reply, but another important thing to remember is that unlike popular opinion, Russia is not running short of ammunition or material. Quite the contrary, they have been able to increase their own capacity to produce defense material in a significant way, and that is concerning. And now that we've heard experts talking about a long-term threat, we need to fight Russia, and one way to do that is to increase our production capacity to the same level as they have in Russia, so that Kremlin will see that, they seem to be able to produce materials in Europe too, so we can't outdo them. So that is one signal to be sent, that we have the necessary capacity to produce material. And if we do that, and if we don't need that, if there is the balance of terror, then maybe then in the future we look back and wish that we would have been able to do that. The arms industry has increased their capacity in the Nordic countries. Now it's 24/7 production, and all the capacity is being used, which means that enterprises or companies cannot do more. So now we need intervention from the states, because normal market mechanism and normal European financing cannot deal with this. But we need to we need to cut corners and make sure that the state, for example, in Finland, could finance building production lines, building production facilities, so that we can increase the production capacity. Although maybe it could be that the state who invests would then get a return on their investment in way of profits from the sales. Lots of things have been said. Less has happened, but now Europe promised to provide 1 million grenades to Ukraine by March, and we cannot live up to that promise in any way possible. Thank you.
Joo, tässä on valitettavasti kulunut aikaa taas ihan.
Mikko, yes, we've been talking about that for the past year, increasing production capacity. So we need genuine measures in the EU and nationally. And what Jukka was chairing, the Defence Committee, made reference that we need the state to intervene in forms of capital to build new facilities, to increase capacity. And that is the way that companies can invest, because they would need to invest a major part. But that is the only way that companies can guarantee their future for 10 or 20 years in advance, and also fill in the storages for the security of supply. But we have to remember that although we take a decision now, then the production lines will only start producing in about 2 years' time. So it is not a quick fix. So we need to make the decisions first, also in the EU at Nordic level, and also with Sweden. We need to do more, and anything that we can do is for the better.
Hör oss här, din finska kollega sa just.
Peter Hultqvist, if you can hear us, your colleague from Finland just said that states need to intervene to increase production capacity. So the markets are not sufficient to meet the needs. What is your opinion? Can you say something on that?
I have the same opinion, because there is a lack of ammunition in Ukraine, and it's about all dimensions and levels of ammunition. And I think that next year will be a very strategic year, because Russia have upgraded its production of ammunition, and we must send more ammunition from the Western democracies. Otherwise, it's a risk that Russia will be stronger than the Ukrainian side about the possibility to use ammunition directly in the warfare. So I think that we must do something very fast in this question, and I am not happy with that. We have talked about production line for now a very long time. And it started a year ago, and maybe more of that. But it hasn't happened so much. And what I know about these artillery grenades from European Union in that project, it will be, I think it's 340,000 grenades that we can deliver of 1 million grenades. So this is a real problem. If we are going to establish new production lines, we need a decision now from the states that they must guarantee an economical guarantee from each country that now it's time for the industry to organize these production lines. Then is the question of the time. And when we see that the Russians can do it, we must also do it. And it must go very fast here. And I think it's too long to wait for 2 years for this. This must happen as soon as possible. And it must be very serious discussions between the government and the defense industry about this. And I think we talk a lot about artillery grenades, but we must talk about all dimensions of ammunition, because every day it will be used a huge amount of ammunition of different sorts. So I agree with my Finnish counterpart.
Tack för det. Ja, Lars, det behövs mera vapen i Ukraina, det behövs mera ammunition.
Eli we need more artillery and ammunition in Ukraine, and time is ticking. It is a difficult, complex question, and we should not forget that we are not only talking about grenades, but also other defense material. There are lots of things that they need apart from ammunition. They need equipped soldiers. We have been sending packages of equipment. It is good. There is a new project on uniform and other materials. And here states should look at how to change production possibilities and capabilities and increasing volumes in order to come clear. Ukraine has been fantastic in showing how grenades can be produced. We also changed that in half a year, how to change the production lines and what is needed. But as everybody here has said, we do need more activity, less words. We've talked enough already.
Publiken kan fundera på.
Yes, more action now. So maybe in the audience you can think about questions, and we will move over to bilateral contacts in the Nordics for a good reason, of course. We've been focusing on NATO and defense planning at NATO level, but we have the Nordic dimension, bilateral defense cooperation. We have NORDEFCO, the Nordic Defense Cooperation Forum, which is a pretty light structure, not lots of bureaucracy, no secretariats, no headquarters, very pragmatic forum for cooperation, as it should be. And in a situation that we are living now, could be very flexible. How could we use NORDEFCO in this situation where both Finland and Sweden are in NATO in the short time? How could we coordinate our policies via NORDEFCO? Inside NORDEFCO, we have different cooperation platforms concerning operations, for example. We can plan operations flexibly between our countries so that we had to send troops to Romania, but then there was too much bureaucracy. But we're pragmatic. Then there are capabilities and armaments, cooperation, lots of research. If we look at research, it is important to see how cooperation can be adapted, what is needed in the field, in the front line. If we analyze the war in Ukraine, of course, past years have been different from this year, and Russia is looking at the same things. They want to learn, they want to become better, but our cycles need to be quicker than those of Russia. And as far as armament is concerned, we need to take the decisions that Peter was referring to, intervention by states, decisions by states, responsibility on physical production. And then we need to see how this is going to be distributed between our countries. And NORDEFCO is a good forum for cooperation. Then about stability, creating stability in the other parts of Europe, we need to take up the overall defense approach. The will to defend in Ukraine has been exceptional. In Finland, you have a system that dates back to the Cold War, and you have continued to keep it up. And Sweden is now building up a new system on the basis of an old system, but adapted to the present situation. Here, of course, we could maybe be an example to the rest of Europe in stabilizing. Thank you. We can say maybe that NATO membership in Finland and Sweden means that all the NORDEFCO countries will be in NATO. All the Nordic countries are not in EU, but in NATO they will be.
Eli kun Ruotsi tulee
When Sweden joins NATO in the weeks to come, I hope, we are all under the umbrella of NATO, but this NORDEFCO structure has been around for years for cooperation. I wouldn't like to refer to NORDEFCO because all the fora that we have, MP8, CHEF, they are all central also in the future under the auspices of NATO. We work together. We plan together for our defense, for exercises, for JEF, for example. Could it be another structure taking care of safety in Northern Europe and around the Baltic Sea? Lots of common denominations. If we look at NATO and their members, they look differently at the world if they are in the south of Europe or here in the north. So we have a responsibility to bring security to our own region. And of course, all these cooperation fora can work within NATO, RP8, NORDEFCO, together with the Baltic countries, and the UK in the JEF cooperation, which is the real superpower maybe of all these, if we look at that from a military point of view. So it brings a clear, strong foothold to the north. Yes, maybe I could add here and complement that we have a Finland-Sweden cooperation in practical operative terms, where we can control situations and incidents as they come. And this is really valuable mechanism for us, and it is worth developing. And it is very flexible, but maybe we can create mechanisms where in extreme situations we can act. MP8 and NORDEFCO maybe, now that we know where the threat comes from the east. So what countries are in the front line? Norway, Finland, and the Baltic countries. The LB8 could be a mechanism where the frontline countries are taken into account, and then going further west, there is some aid available. NATO is a bigger organization, and it takes time before decisions are taken, for example, under Article 5. So our own mechanisms between Finland, Sweden, NORDEFCO, and MP8 could be tools or instruments that can act swiftly. And it should be important that we know that in advance.
Det var frågan alltså, att vad kan vi göra nu med det bilaterala?
Well, Peter Hultqvist, the question was what we can do about the bilateral cooperation, defense cooperation, from the point of view of the Nordic countries, as all Nordic countries are NATO allies. How can we develop this cooperation? Is sky the limit? You can speak Swedish or English, whichever you like. Well, as far as NORDEFCO is concerned, it is an excellent forum where we can position ourselves in Nordic terms within NATO, as all of the Nordic countries are responsible for Scandinavia and for defending the Nordics. The way we coordinate the resources will be extremely important, and that's why we need to consider how we can cooperate and be internally unified within NATO. It is said that we must not have a Nordic bloc, and that's true. But of course, we need to take responsibility for our Nordic security, and that's where we need to consider what we think about our army, our navy, our air forces, how to coordinate these towards NATO. And I think these must become important building blocks in NATO, even though we take part in decision-making in NATO. We must also be prepared from this perspective. Nordefco is politically a very important body. In addition, it's also a matter of how we carry out military practicing, and this is linked to defense planning and challenges. Nordefco will become a heavier body within NATO than outside NATO. And this very much depends on what we are prepared to do, how we are prepared to develop ourselves. I think there is a great potential for the Nordic countries also within NATO. It is not at all a matter of giving up on a 360-degree view. Instead, it's about taking responsibility for our defense in Northern Europe and contributing to NATO with our perspectives, our views, our experience, our know-how. We know this region, we know the geographical requirements, we have a long experience of Russia, we have a lot of intelligence information that other NATO allies don't necessarily have. We can contribute with this expertise. As far as the relationship between Finland and Sweden is concerned, we must absolutely continue developing those. We have a number of strategically important areas such as Gotland and Åland, the Åland Islands, and they are vulnerable strategic objects and areas. In the north, we also have a region where both Sweden and Finland and Norway are involved. And I think we need to take our responsibility, and this is very much linked to the fact that Russia has a major military base in Murmansk. And of course, Russia has certain military interests in Murmansk and in the Nordic region or northern region. And that's why in that Russian zone, it is important to cooperate. So Nordefco has many important tasks that are linked to the defense forces of our countries and their operations, and thereby also to NATO's defense planning. We need other structures, JEF, NB8, etc., to complement the big picture. So this is about different instruments that are linked with the Baltic states, to Poland, to Germany, in other words, the other Baltic Sea countries. All parts must function together. Thank you, Peter. I will now take questions from the audience. Speaking about armaments, armament production, we have Alice Karlberg from Saab. Thank you. I have a background in Finnish-Swedish cooperation, and speaking about investments, during the past 2 years, Saab has doubled its headcount in Finland to more than 200, and we have made investments without government funding. But very often, when we look at such cooperation, the practical details, for example, in armament procurement, for example, in torpedoes, handheld guns, and others where we cooperated with Sweden and Finland. There are many opportunities to improve this cooperation, but it is a rather heavy structure when thinking about the defense forces and their logistics centers. That's where it's the slowest. How we could improve the cooperation even further, that's a good question. And speaking about Nordefco, so far the biggest success were shared uniforms or joint common uniforms. How could we improve or develop Nordefco cooperation to cover even heavier products? We have 4 heads of or commanders of air forces who met and proposed cooperation in terms of a joint Nordic air defense when all of the Nordic countries are NATO allies. So less talk, more deeds. How many jet planes are needed? 250, said Peter Hultqvist. Perhaps I would like to say that in the existing structures, companies should try to increase their capacity. If we try to establish a business consortium within Nordefco cooperation, it will take a lot of time, and we don't have all that time because we are lagging behind our schedule. If the different companies have projects to increase production and capacity, they should do that as quickly as possible so that they get their factories up and running and start producing more. And the idea of joint air defense is a very interesting one, and I'm sure Saab is more aware of the technical possibilities than we politicians are, but I do believe that technical possibilities are there, and I do believe that Finland and Sweden can carry out air defense operations together in a very seamless manner. So this is not at all impossible. So Finland, Sweden and Norway actually practice together, practically speaking, every week in terms of air defense. And we have joint operative planning. And I think it is a matter of the future that we defend the Nordic countries together, also with respect to air defense, because that makes us stronger together, and NATO will bring us more capabilities. And as far as the Nordic cooperation is concerned, all means to enhance this cooperation are welcome, but at the moment, armaments production and an increased armaments production is necessary. We need to produce more to be able to support Ukraine and to fill in our own stocks. So what do you think of United Nordic Air Forces? Well, that sounds very good, but it will certainly increase when we join NATO. But we already have shared exercises, so our tactical practicing is at a very high level, but we still need more exercise politically. We also have air defense systems, missile systems, etc. that must be also considered separately. Now, Peter Hultqvist, when we are included in NATO, we will also be involved in air defense and missile defense. There will be integration taking place within NATO. Having a joint Nordic air defense has less to do with combining our air forces than cooperating and organizing the distribution of resources. It may be that, for example, the Finnish Air Force could utilize bases that in a way that they're not able to do yet. And these resources are needed all the time on both sides. So it may be that the Swedish Air Force would have operative duties that would cover the airspace. This could also be carried out in the Norwegian side. This all takes a lot of planning. We need to keep in mind that however much we practice, exercise, and plan, if there is a difficult situation, the situation will determine what resources will be used and how. But the more we prepare ourselves, the better equipped we will be to deal with such situations. Air defense must be carried out in the way that brings us the highest operative power if we end up in a critical situation. We also need to keep reminding each other that we are having exercises, practically speaking, every week in the north. We also have the Arctic Challenge exercise with 10 to 12 nations involved. These are annual events. And the Swedish Air Force is participating in the autumn exercise of the Finnish Air Force and vice versa. So these operations must be developed and continued. But there's another dimension. We should not forget how important it is that military staff from different countries learn to know each other at a personal level so that their cooperation can work better in a difficult situation, so that you know who you're talking to, who you're cooperating with. Thank you. The latest point was very important. And now that we're speaking about civilian preparedness, Hanasaari is very much involved in it in terms of cooperation with authorities and building up contact networks. So it's really about connecting people, as we used to say. Are there any questions? Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I would like to ask about the changing threat scenario. Peter Hultqvist mentioned the northern region, and Russia is interested in strengthening its resources in Murmansk. And I'm wondering how the traditional Russian troops have been influenced by or impacted by what's happening in Ukraine, or whether they have been impacted. And the changing strategic situations in Finland and Sweden, perhaps, which will perhaps soon both be NATO allies. Russia will change its position and its doctrine in this part of the world, also in the northern region. What is our attitude? What is our opinion of this? Well, at the moment, Russia has, practically speaking, tied up all its troops in Russia, and it's relatively peaceful on the other side of the Finnish-Russian border, because they have moved their troops towards Ukraine. But it is likely that Russia will strengthen their presence and capacity, military presence and capacity, also here in the north. And we were discussing the Nordefco cooperation and what needs to be done in the Arctic. Certainly to strengthen this perspective within NATO is priority number one. Also, in the operative and defense planning within NATO, this will be crucial for us. The climate change is also setting up challenges for us. It has not been mentioned here very much, but of course, in the northern seas, when the transport routes open up in the Arctic Ocean, that makes it a very important area strategically, because Russia already has a presence there, and they will certainly strengthen their military presence there immediately after the Ukrainian war. I can continue about the Arctic region, that of course Russia wants to keep our possibilities open regarding the Arctic region, the Northeastern Passage and so on. Who controls those areas can control the whole northern region. So it's important to make sure that those regions are controlled by the good guys, so to speak. So this also leads to the fact that even the Baltic Sea is extremely important for the security in the Nordic countries. So who controls the Baltic Sea will have an impact on how secure the Nordics are. And now that we are going to get Sweden into NATO, that will strengthen the security in the Baltic Sea region into a completely new level. It will enhance security in the Nordics and so on. And the other potential threats include efforts to exert influence from further south, potential military invasions, and I'm referring to Finland and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. This is a common concern for us, and we need to cooperate among allies. Thank you. Peter. Peter, can you hear us? Would you like to comment? As far as... Well, I need to say first that the whole of Scandinavia, from the Arctic region to the Baltic region and the Baltic Sea, this is one operative region. It all belongs together, and that's why our perspective needs to cover the whole geographic area so that we can be as efficient as possible. The fact that Russia is now temporarily weaker because their troops are based in Ukraine and have suffered major losses, this does not give us any reason to underestimate Russia. They have major forces, they have major armaments production, they will train new recruits, they will give more forces to their troops that have diminished. But what is happening now at the Finnish eastern border, this is just one part of a hybrid attack, because this is aimed to test Finland's reactions. This is a problem that we will have to live with in the long term. And the Finnish government has taken very wise action to make it clear what their standpoint is, and hopefully they will take even more action. And this is certainly a problem that we will be facing for the next few decades, we need to have a high military capability. We need to have a unified Europe. We need to work together in different ways. We need to strengthen Ukraine. We need to maintain the sanctions against Russia. So unity and the military deterrence that we have, those are things that are needed for it to work for Moscow, because they are not afraid to violate international agreements. It may be technical operations at the Finnish border. This may not happen today or tomorrow, but it may be, for example, about the development in a few years' time. We need to listen to what is said and act accordingly. The best way to frighten someone is that they need to pay a very high price if they try to do certain things. We may not resort to wishful thinking. It is important, and it will be interesting to see how they will deal with their Western military district and what the situation will look like and how the situation will be in the future. Thank you, Lars. Well, very briefly. It is extremely important that we look at how Russia operates in this region, depending on how the situation in Ukraine moves on and develops. And it may be that they build fortresses passively, or else they actively conquer new areas. It is an important development that needs to be monitored. If there was a serious conflict in the Baltics or in the Nordic countries, what would happen in the high north? Would they try to conquer areas there? It is very important to monitor this. Thank you very much. And with this comment, I believe that we will soon start wrapping up this year's Hanating conference. We have been considering the threat of Russia, how it should be dealt with, how we should deal with it, how we should look at it. We have heard ministers, we have heard diplomats, scholars, etc. Questions keep changing forms. There will be new questions coming up. That's how the world works. But it is important that we try to understand the time we're living in. That is the only way to build the future. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience, both here in Hanasaari and online. Thank you, Petra Hultqvist, for participating in the discussion remotely. So let's not be judges. Let's rather be doctors. Thank you very much and have a very nice rest of the autumn. Thank you very much.
Tack så mycket. Tack. Vi ses nästa år. Tack Peter.
Tack.